Three figures emerged from the edge of the forest. A German shepherd mother and her two tiny puppies, soaked from the rain and trembling from exhaustion. No one knew where they had come from. No one knew what they had been running from. Several miles away, a retired Navy SEAL drove along a forgotten mountain road, carrying far more memories than luggage. His service was long behind him, but some losses had never learned how to stay in the past. When he spotted the little dog family beside the road, he thought he was making a simple rescue, a warm shelter, a safe meal, a second chance. But the mother dog seemed to want something else, because the very next morning, she led him away from safety and straight toward an empty house hidden deep among the trees. Why would a dog keep returning to a place where no one lived? And what was she trying so desperately to show him? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late autumn had settled quietly over northern Wyoming. The tourist season was gone. The roads were emptier. The forests carried that peculiar stillness that arrived before winter claimed the mountains entirely. Rain drifted through the pine trees in thin gray sheets, soft enough to be ignored by most people, persistent enough to soak through a jacket by the end of the day. Michael Turner had never been most people. At 67, the retired Navy SEAL lived alone in a modest cabin several miles outside the small town of Ashwood. The cabin sat near the edge of a national forest, surrounded by towering pines and rocky hills that seemed older than memory itself. Michael was a large man, despite his age. Time had stolen some speed from him, but very little strength. His shoulders remained broad, his jaw was square and weathered. Short, silver-gray hair covered his head, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a face marked by years of discipline, loss, and silence. Most people in town respected him. Few truly knew him, and that was exactly how Michael preferred it. 10 years earlier, he had buried his only child, or at least that was how he described it to himself. The truth was more complicated. His daughter, Emily Turner, had died in a car accident at the age of 28. The accident itself wasn't what haunted him. It was the conversation that happened before it. Their final conversation. Their final argument. Michael could still remember every word. Sometimes he wished he couldn't. Emily had inherited her mother's stubbornness and her father's refusal to back down. The disagreement had started over something small and meaningless. Most family disasters did. By the end of the conversation, both of them had said things they didn't truly mean. Then Emily had left. Several hours later, the state police arrived at Michael's door. Some wounds healed into scars. Others simply learned how to hide deeper. Michael's never healed at all. The rain tapped softly against his truck windshield as he drove home from town that afternoon. A bag of groceries sat on the passenger seat beside him. Bread, coffee, dog food. Not because he owned a dog. Old habits died hard. During his military years, he'd spent enough time around working dogs to automatically grab a bag whenever he saw a sale. The road curved through dense forest. Michael was halfway home when something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch. Then the branch moved. He slowed immediately. About 30 yards off the roadside stood a German shepherd. The dog looked exhausted. Its sable-colored coat was soaked by rain. Mud clung to its legs. Its ribs showed faintly beneath damp fur. More alarming were the two tiny puppies pressed against its side. The puppies couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Both were trembling. One struggled to stand. The other buried itself beneath its mother's body for warmth. Michael parked without thinking. Military training taught people to assess danger. Fatherhood had once taught him something else. He stepped from the truck and approached slowly. "Easy there," he said quietly. The mother dog watched him carefully. Her amber eyes never left his face. Michael expected fear, maybe aggression. Instead, the dog seemed exhausted beyond either emotion. The puppies whimpered. The sound hit him harder than it should have. For a moment, he wasn't standing beside a Wyoming road. For a moment, he was standing outside a hospital room 10 years earlier, listening to sounds he could never forget. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Then he forced himself back into the present. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get you out of this rain." The mother dog hesitated. Then, surprisingly, she allowed him to approach. One puppy was light enough to lift with a single arm. The second was only slightly heavier. The mother followed as Michael carried both puppies toward the truck. Not because she trusted him, because she had no better option. Sometimes survival required faith, even when faith felt foolish. The drive home was quiet. The puppies slept almost immediately. The mother dog never did. She sat upright in the back seat the entire journey, watching, waiting, thinking. At least that's how it seemed. When they reached the cabin, Michael prepared blankets near the fireplace. The puppies quickly claimed the warmest corner of the room. Within minutes, they were stumbling across the floor like tiny drunks. One crashed directly into a chair leg. The other attempted to climb a blanket and immediately rolled backward. Michael couldn't help laughing. The sound surprised him. It had been a while since he'd heard it. The puppies spent the next hour exploring every inch of the cabin. One stole a sock. The other discovered its own reflection in a glass cabinet and barked heroically at the mysterious puppy trapped inside. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive. Not happy, not yet, but alive. The mother dog remained different. While the puppies played, she paced. While they slept, she watched. Several times she approached the front door. Each time she stared through the window toward the northern forest. The same direction, always the same direction. Michael noticed. Years in special operations had trained him to observe patterns. Animals had patterns too, and this one bothered him. By evening, he found an old notebook and began making notes. 7:12 p.m. Mother dog watches north tree line. 7:46 p.m. Returns to front door. 8:11 p.m. Watches forest again. The behavior continued. Eventually, Michael sat beside the fireplace and studied her. "You looking for someone?" The dog turned her head. For a brief moment, those amber eyes seemed strangely human, not literally, emotionally, as if carrying knowledge she couldn't explain. Michael shook the thought away. That was ridiculous. Dogs were dogs. People saw meaning because they wanted meaning. Still, something felt unusual. Around midnight, the puppies finally collapsed into sleep. The mother dog remained awake, watching the door, waiting. Michael eventually chose a name. Daisy. The dog's ears twitched. "Daisy," he repeated. The name seems to fit. Gentle but resilient. Worn by weather but still standing. Much like the dog herself. Much like some people. Outside, rain continued falling through the darkness. Inside, the fire crackled softly. For the first time in many years, Michael didn't spend the evening staring at old photographs or replaying old regrets. Instead, he found himself watching 3 dogs and wondering what story had brought them here. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds. Michael rose early, old military habits again. Coffee first, then breakfast, then checking on the dogs. Except something was wrong. The puppies were there, the blankets were there, the front door stood slightly open, and Daisy was gone. Michael set down his coffee immediately. A knot formed in his stomach. He grabbed his jacket and headed outside. Fresh paw prints led away from the cabin. North. Always north. The trail carried him through wet forest, across a narrow creek, and deeper into the trees than he had traveled in years. Nearly 40 minutes later, he stepped into a clearing, then stopped. Ahead of him stood an old, abandoned house hidden among towering pines. Broken windows, weathered wood, a sagging front porch. And standing perfectly still at the foot of the steps was Daisy, waiting, as if she had been expecting him all along. The old house stood in the clearing like a forgotten sentence no one had finished reading. Michael remained at the edge of the property for several moments, studying it carefully. Years of military service had taught him that appearances often lied. A quiet building could hide danger. An abandoned place could still hold secrets. Daisy waited near the porch steps, not nervous, not excited. Waiting. The German shepherd looked back at him once, then climbed the weathered steps and sat beside the front door, as if inviting him inside. Michael frowned. "You're acting like you own the place." Daisy's ears twitched. The dog said nothing, of course, but somehow Michael felt challenged anyway. The front door hung slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Pine needles had gathered against the porch. Moss crept along the wooden railings. Yet something felt strange. The abandonment looked old. The neglect did not. Michael stepped onto the porch. No footprints, no fresh tire tracks, no signs of recent visitors. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone still belonged here. Daisy moved immediately toward one of the windows. She sniffed, paused, then walked to the opposite side of the porch. Again and again she circled the house before returning to Michael. The behavior seemed purposeful, not random, not curious, purposeful. The front door opened with a long groan. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Michael entered slowly. The air smelled of old wood, paper, and time. The living room appeared frozen, not destroyed, frozen. A knitted blanket rested neatly on a sofa. Several books remained stacked beside an armchair. A pair of reading glasses sat atop a small table. Everything looked as though the owner had stood up one afternoon intending to return in 5 minutes, and never did. Michael walked deeper inside. No electricity, no running water, no signs of modern activity. Yet, strangely, there was no evidence of theft either. No smashed furniture, no vandalism, no broken cabinets. The place had been left untouched, as if protected by an invisible agreement. Daisy entered the room behind him. She approached the armchair, sat, and stared at it. Michael stopped. The chair itself was ordinary, a faded blue recliner with worn armrests. Yet Daisy looked at it with such intensity that it made him uncomfortable. The way people sometimes stared at graves. Michael shook the thought away. "Come on," he muttered. "You're starting to creep me out." Daisy remained where she was, for several seconds. Then she quietly lowered her head onto the armrest. The gesture carried a strange sadness. Michael suddenly found himself thinking about Emily, about the empty chair that still sat in his own cabin, the chair no one else ever used, the chair he had never been able to move. Human beings were strange creatures. We claimed objects didn't matter, then spent decades protecting them from change. The realization followed him as he explored the remainder of the house. The kitchen remained intact. The dining room remained intact. A calendar still hung on the wall, 5 years old, stopped forever in October. Michael carefully memorized the date, then returned to town later that afternoon. Not because he had answers, because he suddenly had questions. And questions were difficult to ignore. Ashwood's post office occupied a small brick building near Main Street. The place had changed very little over the years. Its owner had changed even less. Margaret Holloway sat behind the counter sorting envelopes when Michael entered. Margaret was 78 years old and possessed the unique ability to know everyone's business without appearing nosy. She stood barely 5 feet tall. Her silver hair was always gathered into a neat bun. Her pale blue eyes remained sharp despite her age. Years of listening had made her patient. Years of loss had made her kind. The town trusted her because she rarely judged anyone. Michael approached the counter. "Need something?" Margaret asked. "Information. That's usually more expensive than stamps." Michael almost smiled. Almost. "I found an old house north of the forest trail." Margaret paused. The slightest pause. But Michael noticed. "The White House?" she asked quietly. "Maybe. The one near Willow Creek?" Michael nodded. Margaret's expression softened. "That's Eleanor's house." The name meant nothing to Michael. Yet something about the way Margaret spoke it suggested it once meant a great deal to others. "Who was Eleanor?" Margaret leaned back slowly. "Eleanor Bishop." For a moment, she seemed to be looking through memory rather than at Michael. "One of the nicest women who ever lived here." Michael waited. "Eleanor taught music at the elementary school for over 30 years. Piano, mostly. Sometimes choir. Every Christmas, half the town ended up singing because Eleanor convinced them they could." A small smile appeared, then faded. "What happened to her?" "No one really knows." Michael frowned. "No one?" Margaret shook her head. 5 years ago, she simply disappeared. People don't just disappear. They do, more often than you'd think." Michael remained silent. Margaret folded her hands together. She wasn't the kind of woman who made enemies. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't running from anything. One day she was here, the next day she wasn't. Police? They looked. And? They found nothing. Outside, a truck passed along Main Street. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Margaret added quietly, "The strange part wasn't that she left." "What was?" "No goodbye." Michael immediately understood. Goodbyes mattered, especially when they never happened. Margaret glanced toward the window. "You know what everyone remembers most?" "What?" "Her dog." Michael's attention sharpened instantly. "A German Shepherd?" Margaret nodded. "Beautiful dog." A cold feeling moved through Michael's chest. "Daisy." Margaret blinked. "What?" "The dog I found." For the first time since the conversation began, Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "You found her?" Michael nodded. Neither spoke, because suddenly the situation felt much less ordinary. By sunset, Michael returned to the abandoned house. The puppies remained safe at the cabin. Daisy, however, had raced ahead the moment she saw the forest trail. Now she waited at the porch once more, patient, certain, like a guide completing unfinished work. Inside, Michael searched more carefully, room by room, drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf. The upstairs bedrooms revealed little. The attic revealed less. Yet something continued bothering him. The house felt preserved, not forgotten. Eventually, he entered a small study tucked behind the kitchen. A wooden desk occupied one corner. The drawers were swollen with age. Most contained old bills, receipts, school paperwork, nothing important. Then Michael opened the final drawer. Something slid forward. A photograph. Old, faded, its edges yellowed by time. Michael picked it up and froze. The photograph showed a younger woman standing in front of the very same house. Beside her sat a German Shepherd. Not similar, not familiar. The same dog, the same amber eyes, The same markings, the same face. Daisy, years younger, but unmistakably Daisy. The dog standing beside him now. Michael slowly lowered the photograph. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the clearing. Inside, the house seemed quieter than before, as if it had been waiting for someone to find that picture. Daisy stepped forward and gently touched the photograph with her nose, then looked directly into Michael's eyes, waiting. For the next several days, Michael Turner found himself thinking about a woman he had never met. The photograph remained on the kitchen table inside his cabin. Every morning he looked at it while drinking coffee. Every evening he found himself staring at it again. The image showed a woman in her early 60s standing beneath the porch of the abandoned house. She had kind eyes and a warm smile. Her silver blonde hair fell just past her shoulders. The lines on her face suggested a life spent laughing more than complaining. Beside her sat Daisy, younger but unmistakable. The strange thing wasn't the photograph. The strange thing was the feeling it left behind. It felt less like evidence, more like an introduction. The Puppies had settled comfortably into cabin life. One had developed an unhealthy obsession with Michael's boots. The other had discovered that stealing dish towels was apparently the highest form of entertainment available in Wyoming. Several times a day, Michael found himself chasing tiny furry criminals around the living room. Each time he caught them, he realized something uncomfortable. He was smiling. It had been a long time since his home contained laughter, even if most of it came from dogs. Daisy remained different. The German Shepherd spent much of her time near the cabin windows, watching, waiting, always watching. Sometimes she stared toward the northern forest. Sometimes she stared directly at Michael, as though measuring his progress, as though she had brought him into a story and was becoming impatient with how slowly he read it. 3 days after finding the photograph, Michael returned to Ashwood. This time he visited the town library. The building occupied an old stone church that had been converted decades earlier. It smelled faintly of books, dust, and floor polish. Behind the main desk sat a woman Michael vaguely recognized. Her name tag read Linda. Linda Mercer appeared to be around 60 years old. She was tall and slender with curly gray hair pulled loosely behind her head. Thin reading glasses rested low on her nose. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades helping people find answers without demanding credit for it. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Maybe." Michael placed the photograph on the desk. Linda adjusted her glasses, then immediately smiled. "Oh, you know her?" Everyone knew Eleanor. The answer surprised him. Margaret had said something similar. The more people spoke about Eleanor Bishop, the more impossible her disappearance seemed. "What was she like?" Linda's smile softened. "The kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's your description?" "It tells you more than you think." Linda leaned back in her chair. Eleanor wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She wasn't important in the way newspapers define important. She paused. But if a student lost confidence, she noticed. If an elderly neighbor needed groceries, she helped. If someone was lonely, somehow she always knew. Michael remained silent, because those kinds of people rarely disappeared without leaving scars behind. Linda opened a filing cabinet. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a thin folder. Eleanor volunteered at nearly every school event for 32 years. Michael flipped through newspaper clippings, choir performances, music recitals, charity events, photographs of smiling children surrounding a piano. The same woman appeared again and again, always smiling, always helping. Then the article stopped, abruptly, around 7 years earlier. Michael noticed it immediately. "What happened here?" Linda's expression changed. The answer arrived before the words. Pain recognized pain. "Her son died." Michael looked up. Linda nodded. "Army." The room suddenly felt quieter. "What happened?" Roadside bomb overseas. Michael closed the folder. He didn't need details. Soldiers understood certain sentences without explanation. After that, she changed. Linda chose her words carefully. Not overnight. Grief rarely works that way. Michael understood that too. She stopped attending community events, stopped teaching private lessons, stopped showing up for coffee gatherings. Depression? Maybe, Linda sighed. Mostly she became smaller. Michael frowned. What does that mean? Linda looked toward the window. It means she was still alive, but less of her showed up every year. The answer stayed with Michael long after he left, because he knew exactly what she meant. Sometimes grief didn't kill people. It simply reduced them, piece by piece, memory by memory, hope by hope, until only a shadow remained. Back at the cabin, rain began falling again, a steady autumn rain, not dramatic, just persistent. Michael sat beside the fireplace. The puppies slept nearby. Daisy rested several feet away, watching him, always watching him. For a long time, nobody moved. Then Michael spoke, not because he planned to, because silence finally became heavier than words. You know, Daisy lifted her head. My daughter hated fishing. The confession sounded ridiculous. Of all the memories he could have shared, that was the first one. Yet somehow it continued. Every summer I'd drag her to the lake. Michael stared into the fire. She complained every single time. The corner of his mouth twitched. She called it boredom with mosquitoes. Daisy listened, or appeared to. Michael wasn't entirely sure. Maybe he was talking to himself. Maybe that was the point. I never told anyone that. The fire crackled softly. The puppies slept. The rain tapped against the windows. And for the first time in 10 years, Michael said the name aloud. Emily. The word felt strange, fragile, sacred, like opening a door sealed shut for years. He spoke for nearly an hour, about birthdays, arguments, road trips, bad jokes, forgotten moments, tiny memories no one else would ever care about. Yet somehow they mattered. Because people didn't disappear all at once. Sometimes they survived inside stories. When he finally stopped talking, Daisy approached. The dog gently rested her head against his knee. No dramatic gesture, no miracle. Just quiet companionship. And somehow that felt more honest. The following afternoon, Michael returned to Eleanor's house. He wasn't searching for answers anymore, not exactly. He was searching for understanding. The difference mattered. The house greeted him with the same stillness, the same silence, the same sense of waiting. For nearly 2 hours he examined rooms he had already searched. Nothing new appeared, no hidden documents, no clues, no revelations. Then Daisy suddenly stood, alert, focused, purposeful. Without hesitation, she crossed the living room and headed upstairs. Michael followed. The dog climbed to the second floor, then continued upward toward a narrow staircase leading into the attic. Michael stopped. He hadn't explored the attic thoroughly. The space had seemed too cluttered, too insignificant. Daisy disappeared into the darkness above. A moment later, she barked. Once. Sharp. Intentional. Michael climbed after her. Dust filled the air. The attic was cramped and dim. Old furniture stood beneath white sheets. Boxes lined the walls. Nothing unusual. At first. Then he saw Daisy. The German shepherd stood beside an old wooden trunk. Not touching it, not scratching it. Simply standing there. Waiting. Michael approached, slowly. The trunk was unlocked. When he lifted the lid, a cloud of dust rose into the air. Inside lay dozens of neatly stacked envelopes. Dozens, maybe more. Every one carefully addressed. Every one sealed. Every one unsent. Michael picked up the first letter, then another.
then another. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. The recipient was always the same. His breath caught because every envelope carried the same name, and there were far too many of them. Someone had spent years writing letters that never reached their destination.
Michael sat alone in the attic long after the sun had begun to set. Dust floated through thin beams of fading light. The old trunk remained open before him. Around him lay dozens of carefully arranged envelopes, each carrying the same destination. Not a place, a person. My beloved son. Every letter began differently. Every letter ended with love. None had ever been sent. Daisy sat nearby, watching quietly. The German shepherd seemed unusually calm, almost as if she already knew what the letters contained. Perhaps she had watched Eleanor write some of them years ago. Perhaps she simply recognized familiar objects carrying familiar scents. Michael picked up the first envelope, then another, then another. Hours passed. The letters told a story, not through dramatic revelations, through ordinary days. The first few had been written shortly after Eleanor's son died. She described the weather, the garden, the tomatoes that had finally grown after several failed attempts, a neighbor's new truck, the sort of things parents shared when they expected another conversation tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. The next letters changed, slowly, almost invisibly. The cheerful details became quieter. The spaces between sentences became longer. Questions appeared, then apologies, then loneliness. One letter simply read, "I still set an extra plate at Thanksgiving." Another, "I know it makes no sense, but I still expect to hear your truck in the driveway." Michael lowered the page. The words felt familiar, too familiar. Human beings often believed grief looked dramatic, crying, screaming, breaking. The truth was usually smaller. An untouched chair, an empty phone call. A birthday remembered by only one person. The world continued moving, while part of someone's heart remained frozen. He understood that now more than ever, because he had spent 10 years doing exactly the same thing. Emily's room had remained untouched for years after her death. The books stayed where she left them. The photographs remained in place. Even after he finally packed most of her belongings away, he never truly let them go. Sometimes he still spoke to her while driving. Sometimes he caught himself wondering what she would think about something. Sometimes he found himself reaching for his phone before remembering there was nobody left to call. Different stories, same wound. By the time darkness settled outside, Michael had read nearly 20 letters. He carefully returned them to the trunk, not because he was finished, because some grief deserved respect. The drive back to the cabin felt unusually quiet. For the first time in years, Michael wasn't thinking about military operations, or regrets, or unfinished arguments. He was thinking about Eleanor, a woman who had loved someone so deeply that she continued writing letters long after receiving no reply. And perhaps, in some strange way, he envied her. At least she had found words. For years, Michael had hidden from his own. When he opened the cabin door, chaos greeted him immediately. One of the puppies came running across the floor, carrying half of a dish towel. The second puppy chased behind it like an angry detective pursuing a criminal. Neither seemed particularly concerned by the destruction left in their wake. Michael stared. The puppies stared back. The larger one wagged its tail proudly, as if expecting praise. Michael sighed. "You're both lucky you're cute." The puppies interpreted this as approval. Several minutes later, one stole a slipper. The other knocked over a basket. By bedtime, Michael had rescued 3 socks, 2 gloves, and what remained of a newspaper. Yet somewhere during the process he noticed something unusual. The cabin no longer felt empty. Messy, absolutely. Quiet? Not anymore. For years the building had echoed, every room carried silence. Now tiny paws raced across wooden floors, small bodies tumbled through hallways. The fireplace no longer illuminated loneliness. It illuminated life. Michael found himself smiling more often than he realized. Not because happiness had suddenly returned, healing didn't work that way. But perhaps sorrow no longer occupied every available space. That night he sat beside the fire while Daisy rested nearby. The puppies slept in a tangled pile of fur. Michael looked around the room, then laughed softly. Emily would have loved these little troublemakers. The words escaped before he could stop them. For a moment, sadness followed. Then something unexpected happened. The sadness stayed gentle, not sharp, not crushing. Gentle, as if the memory had finally stopped fighting him. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, warmth filled the room. And for the first time in many years, Michael felt something resembling home. The following afternoon, he returned to Eleanor's house. This time, he brought several storage boxes, not to remove anything, to organize the letters. The collection was larger than he originally thought. Nearly every envelope carried a date. Years of dates, years of conversations, years of unanswered love. As he worked, Daisy remained close. Sometimes she watched. Sometimes she wandered through the rooms. Sometimes she disappeared briefly before returning. Always returning. Michael reached the bottom of the trunk near sunset. Only a handful of letters remained. The handwriting had changed. The elegant flowing script appeared shakier, less steady. Age, perhaps. Or something else. He opened one carefully. The contents felt different. Not because of what Eleanor wrote, because of what she forgot. Several names were crossed out and corrected. Dates had been rewritten. Sentences wandered, thoughts repeated. A subtle confusion lingered between the lines. Michael noticed immediately. The same way experienced mechanics heard problems hidden inside an engine. Something had changed in Eleanor's final years. The last envelope rested alone at the bottom. Unlike the others, it carried no date, no stamp, no address, just a single handwritten note. For whoever finds this. Michael felt his pulse quicken. Slowly he unfolded the pages. The handwriting trembled noticeably. Several words appeared scratched out and rewritten, yet the message remained clear. Eleanor explained that she feared she was beginning to forget things, faces, names, memories. Some mornings she woke uncertain about the day. Other mornings she struggled to remember simple details. She wrote that Daisy seemed to notice before anyone else. The dog stayed close, watched constantly, as though trying to protect memories she could not understand. Michael continued reading. The room grew very still. Then he reached the final paragraph. His eyes stopped moving. For several seconds he simply stared at the page. Daisy approached quietly. The German shepherd sat beside him, waiting. The final sentence read, "If someone finds these letters one day, please help Daisy finish what I could not." Michael lowered the paper slowly. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the forest. Inside the house, silence returned. But this time, it felt different. Not empty, expectant. As if somewhere beyond the letters, beyond the house, beyond the years of unanswered grief, another piece of the story was waiting. The sentence stayed with Michael for 3 days. If someone finds these letters one day, please help Daisy finish what I could not. It followed him into sleep. It followed him through breakfast. It followed him during long walks through the forest. The problem was simple. He had no idea what Eleanor had failed to finish. The answer could have been anything: a promise, a journey, a reconciliation, a goodbye. Yet Daisy behaved as though she knew exactly what it was. The German Shepherd had become increasingly restless, not anxious, focused. Each morning after breakfast, she would stand near the front door and wait. The moment Michael grabbed his jacket, she seemed relieved, as if another small step was finally being taken. One cold morning, Michael spread Eleanor's letters across his dining table. The puppies immediately attempted to help by sitting directly on top of the evidence. After several failed negotiations and one stolen envelope, Michael finally regained control of the investigation. He began reading the letters differently, not searching for emotions, searching for locations. Patterns emerged. Certain places appeared repeatedly: Willow Creek, an old train depot, a church near the southern edge of town, a veterans memorial, a lakeside overlook in the hills. Places connected to Eleanor's son, places connected to memories, places connected to love. By noon, Michael had a list. Daisy walked over, glanced at the paper, then stared directly at him. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you're trying to tell me." The first destination was Willow Creek. The stream wound through a quiet valley several miles from Eleanor's house. According to one of the letters, Eleanor's son had spent entire summers fishing there as a boy. When Michael arrived, Daisy immediately left the trail. She moved confidently through the grass, not wandering, leading. The same certainty appeared again, the same purpose. Eventually, she stopped beneath a large cottonwood tree beside the water. Michael looked around. Nothing remarkable. Then he noticed something carved into the trunk, 2 initials, E.B., and beneath them another set, J.B., Eleanor Bishop and her son. The carving looked decades old, weathered but visible. Michael stood quietly. People spent so much time chasing grand achievements, yet sometimes the most valuable thing they left behind was a tiny mark on a tree, proof that they had loved someone, proof that they had been there. The next location took him to an abandoned train depot outside Ashwood. The building had been closed for years. Paint peeled from the walls. Broken windows reflected gray autumn skies. Yet Daisy led him directly to an old bench beneath the station canopy. Another memory. Another place mentioned in the letters. Michael sat down. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then he realized what Eleanor had written. Her son had waited there before leaving for basic training. She had sat beside him for nearly an hour. Neither knew it would be one of their final, peaceful afternoons together. Michael looked down the empty tracks. The older he became, the more he believed life wasn't measured by major events. It was measured by ordinary moments people only understood later. The bench, the conversation, the goodbye. The things nobody recognized as important until they became impossible to repeat. Over the next week, Daisy guided him to location after location, each one connected to another story from the letters, each one connected to another version of Eleanor. And something unexpected happened. The people Michael met rarely described the same woman. At the church, he met Pastor Raymond Cole. Raymond was 65, tall and broad-shouldered, with deep-set brown eyes and a neatly trimmed white beard. Years of listening to grief had softened his voice without weakening it. "Eleanor," he said with a smile. "She used to argue with me." Michael blinked. "Argue?" "Constantly." The pastor laughed. "Most people thought she was sweet." "She wasn't?" "Oh, she was." The smile widened. "But she was stubborn, too. If she thought something mattered, she'd fight for it." Michael considered that. It didn't match the quiet woman from the letters, yet somehow it felt true. 2 days later, he spoke with another resident. Harold Finch owned the town's hardware store. Harold was 72, lean as a fence post, with weathered skin and hands permanently stained by decades of work. "Eleanor scared me," Harold admitted. Michael nearly laughed.
You're serious? Absolutely, Harold nodded. Whenever she saw me avoiding a problem, she'd call me out. Another version, another piece. The kind teacher, the stubborn fighter, the grieving mother, the lonely woman, the helpful neighbor. People were never one story. Human beings were collections of stories, most of them invisible. Michael found himself thinking about Emily again, how different people would describe her. A talented photographer, a stubborn daughter, a loyal friend, a dreamer. None wrong, none complete. Perhaps that was the tragedy of loss. The people who remained behind were forced to carry unfinished versions of those they loved. Late one afternoon, Daisy led him somewhere new, not listed in any letter, not marked on his notes. She seemed unusually determined. The drive carried them beyond Ashwood, then beyond the neighboring communities. Eventually, they reached the small town of Fairhaven. Michael frowned. This was nearly 40 miles away. Why would Daisy come here? The dog exited the truck immediately. No hesitation, no uncertainty. She crossed a parking lot lined with maple trees, then stopped. Michael followed. His footsteps slowed. A large brick building stood before them, clean, well-maintained, peaceful. A sign near the entrance identified the facility, Fairhaven Senior Living Center, a nursing home. Michael stared. His pulse quickened. The final letter, the memory problems, the forgotten names, the confusion. Suddenly, several pieces began fitting together. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and fresh flowers. A receptionist looked up from behind the front desk. The woman appeared to be in her 40s, with dark brown hair pulled into a professional bun and warm eyes that immediately suggested kindness. Her name tag read, Sarah Jennings. Before Michael could speak, Daisy moved forward. The German shepherd's entire posture changed. Not excited, hopeful. Sarah noticed instantly. Then her expression froze. For several seconds, she stared at Daisy. Recognition spread slowly across her face. "My goodness," she whispered. Michael felt his heart begin to pound. "You know this dog?" Sarah looked from Daisy to Michael, then back to Daisy. The silence answered the question before the words arrived. "Yes," she said softly. "I do." Michael stepped closer. "How?" Sarah swallowed. Her eyes suddenly carried a sadness he recognized immediately, the sadness of someone remembering difficult things. "Because," she said quietly, "Eleanor still asks about her." Michael stopped breathing for a moment. The room seemed to shrink around him. Every clue, every letter, every journey, every question led to this. Eleanor Bishop had never vanished. Eleanor Bishop was alive.
For a long moment, Michael Turner simply stood in the lobby of Fairhaven Senior Living Center. Alive. The word echoed through his mind. Not missing, not vanished, not dead. Alive. After weeks of questions, abandoned houses, forgotten letters, and silent clues, the answer felt strangely heavy. Some truths arrived like lightning, others arrived like winter, slowly, relentlessly, leaving no room to hide. Beside him, Daisy remained perfectly still. The German shepherd stared toward the hallway beyond the reception desk, waiting. Sarah Jennings noticed. The nurse's expression softened. "You should probably sit down," she said gently. Michael shook his head. "No." His voice came out rougher than intended. "I think I'd rather hear it standing." Sarah nodded. She seemed to understand. Some stories demanded gravity. The nurse led Michael into a small office overlooking a garden courtyard. Outside, several elderly residents sat beneath colorful autumn trees. Some read books, some talked quietly. Others simply watched birds. Life continued, even in places where memory often struggled.
Sarah sat across from him. For a few moments, she searched for the right words. Michael recognized the look. People searching for gentle ways to deliver painful truths. Eventually, she spoke. Eleanor arrived here nearly 4 years ago. Michael listened carefully. Her condition had already progressed by then. What condition? Sarah folded her hands together. Early dementia. The words landed softly. The meaning did not. Michael looked toward the window. Part of him had already suspected. The letters, the confusion, the crossed-out names, the forgotten dates. Now the pieces fit together. Sarah continued. At first, she only forgot small things. Michael almost laughed. Small things. Human beings always called them small things. Keys, appointments, names, dates. Then one day, those small things became faces, and lives, and entire histories. What happened? Michael asked. Sarah sighed. According to the records, she lived alone after her son's death. Michael nodded. That much he knew. Without family nearby, nobody noticed how quickly things were changing. Sarah opened a folder. Neighbors reported strange incidents. What kind? Leaving the stove on? Forgetting where she parked her car? Wandering several miles from home? Michael lowered his eyes. He could picture it. A woman losing pieces of herself while the world carried on around her. No villain, no conspiracy. Just time. Perhaps the most merciless force of all. Eventually, Sarah continued. A social worker became involved. Michael looked up. The woman flipped through several pages. Her name was Rebecca Nolan. Sarah handed him a photograph from the file. Rebecca appeared to be in her early 50s. She had short auburn hair, warm brown eyes, and the tired but compassionate expression common among people who spent their careers helping strangers through difficult moments. Rebecca worked with Eleanor during the transition. What happened to her? Retired last year. Sarah smiled faintly. She used to say Eleanor was one of the kindest residents she'd ever met. Michael stared at the photograph. The same description appeared everywhere. Kind. Not extraordinary, not famous, kind. Maybe people underestimated how rare that actually was. Sarah continued. When Eleanor's condition worsened, the court approved assisted care. Michael frowned. What about Daisy? The nurse's expression changed. A shadow crossed her face. That was the hardest part. Michael's stomach tightened. Sarah looked down briefly, then spoke. Eleanor became confused about where she lived. She stopped recognizing familiar places. Sometimes she thought her son was still alive. Sometimes she believed she was 30 years younger. Michael remained silent, because grief already stole enough from people. Memory loss seemed almost cruel. Sarah continued quietly. One day, she forgot Daisy. The room felt suddenly colder. Michael glanced toward the lobby, toward the dog waiting outside. Forgot? Sarah nodded. Not permanently at first. But the episodes became more frequent. Michael imagines Daisy approaching her owner, waiting for recognition, receiving confusion instead. The thought hurt more than expected. Daisy kept trying. Sarah smiled sadly. Every day. The nurse's eyes drifted toward the hallway. As Eleanor forgot more, Daisy stayed closer. She followed her constantly, watched her, protected her. The same way she still watched Michael, the same way she seemed to watch everyone she loved. Some creatures understood loyalty better than humans ever would. Sarah leaned back. When Eleanor entered full-time care, Animal restrictions made it impossible to keep Daisy here. Michael already knew the rest, or thought he did. Yet hearing it made the truth harder. A volunteer arranged temporary placement. Sarah paused.
But Daisy kept escaping. Michael almost smiled, despite himself. That sounded familiar. Escaping where? Sarah looked directly at him. Back to the old house. The answer silenced the room. For years, while Eleanor forgot, while neighbors assumed she had vanished, while the house sat abandoned, Daisy had continued returning. Again and again and again. Not because she was lost, because she remembered. Michael suddenly understood something. The dog hadn't been searching for the house. The house had never been the destination. The house was simply the last place where Eleanor still existed completely. The last place where memory remained untouched. Humans preserved photographs. Dogs preserved routines. Perhaps both were ways of refusing goodbye. Later that afternoon, Sarah finally asked the question both had avoided. Would you like to meet her? Michael looked toward Daisy. The German shepherd had already risen to her feet, waiting, always waiting. Yes, he said quietly. Sarah led them through several hallways. The building felt peaceful, not sad, just fragile, like a library filled with fading books. Each room contained a lifetime. Each resident carried stories someone else might soon forget. Eventually, they stopped outside a sunlit sitting room. An elderly woman sat beside the window. For a moment, Michael barely recognized her. The photographs had shown energy, movement, life. Time had thinned her frame considerably. Eleanor Bishop appeared smaller than expected. Her silver hair was cut short. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Yet her eyes remained gentle. The same eyes from every photograph. Sarah stepped forward. Eleanor? The woman turned slowly. A polite smile appeared. The smile people offered strangers. Not friends, not family. Strangers. Michael felt something break inside him. Not dramatically, quietly, the way old wood cracked under pressure. Sarah knelt beside her chair. I have someone I'd like you to meet. Daisy moved forward, slowly, carefully. No excitement, no barking, only hope. The German shepherd approached the woman she had spent years searching for. Eleanor looked down. Confusion flickered across her face, then uncertainty, then nothing. No recognition, no memory, no sudden miracle. Michael watched Daisy closely. The dog sat beside Eleanor's chair, waiting, patient, faithful, the same way she always had. Eleanor studied the dog for several long seconds. Then something unexpected happened. She reached out. Her fingers touched Daisy's head, and although no recognition appeared in her eyes, tears suddenly filled them. Winter arrived quietly across Wyoming. The forest surrounding Michael Turner's cabin no longer carried the colors of autumn. Bare branches stretched against pale skies, and cold winds moved through the valleys like old ghosts searching for familiar roads. Yet something inside Michael had begun changing, not dramatically. Healing rarely arrived with fanfare. More often it appeared as small differences, a longer walk, a lighter breath, a morning that felt slightly less heavy than the one before. 3 times a week, Michael drove Daisy to Fairhaven Senior Living Center. The routine formed naturally. No promises, no expectations, simply showing up. At first, he believed the visits were for Daisy. Eventually, he realized they were helping all 3 of them. Sarah Jennings greeted them each time with the same warm smile. Over the past several weeks, she had become more than a nurse in Michael's eyes. She had become one of those rare people who understood that some wounds could not be fixed, but could still be accompanied. Good morning, Michael. Morning. She's waiting by the piano again? The answer surprised him less every time, because Eleanor had developed a habit. Whenever Daisy visited, she drifted toward the old piano in the community room. No one knew why, not even Eleanor herself. The piano had stood there for years. Most residents ignored it. Eleanor never played it anymore, at least not consciously. Yet she always sat beside it, waiting. The first few visits had been painful. Eleanor rarely recognized Michael. Sometimes she believed he was a maintenance worker. Other times she thought he was a former student. Once she asked if he was delivering mail. Michael never corrected her. What would have been the point? Identity mattered less than kindness. The strange moments arrived unexpectedly. One afternoon, Daisy rested beneath the piano while Eleanor sat nearby. A volunteer began playing a simple melody. Nothing remarkable, just an old hymn. Halfway through the song, Eleanor suddenly started humming. The room fell silent. Even Sarah stopped walking. The melody continued. Eleanor hummed every note perfectly. Not the words, not the title, only the music. When the song ended, confusion returned immediately. "What was that?" Eleanor asked. Nobody had an answer, but Michael thought about it all evening. Human memory was strange. Names disappeared, addresses vanished, entire decades could be lost, yet somehow a melody survived. Perhaps the heart stored things differently than the mind. Weeks later, another moment arrived. A small one, the kind most people would miss. Daisy had fallen asleep beside Eleanor's chair. The old woman looked down and absent-mindedly scratched behind the dog's ear. Instantly, a smile appeared on her face. Not recognition, not memory. Something deeper. Comfort. Familiarity. A feeling without a name. For several seconds, Eleanor looked peaceful. Then she whispered something. "So there you are." Michael's chest tightened. Sarah heard it too. Neither spoke, because some moments became smaller when analyzed. They simply sat with them and treasured them. The visits continued. Tiny fragments emerged. A melody, a smile, a touch, a familiar feeling. Never enough to rebuild the past, yet enough to prove something remained. Michael often found himself thinking about Emily during the drives home. Not with the old, sharp pain, with curiosity. For years he had treated grief like a locked room. He believed survival meant never opening the door, never looking inside, never touching anything. Now he wasn't so sure. One snowy evening, after returning from Fairhaven, Michael climbed into the attic of his cabin. A single cardboard box sat in the far corner. Dust covered the top. He hadn't opened it in 10 years, not once. The box belonged to Emily. For a long time, he simply stared at it. Funny how an ordinary object could feel heavier than 100 pounds. Fear often disguised itself as avoidance. Eventually, he carried the box downstairs. The puppies immediately became interested. They were much larger now, no longer tiny balls of fur, still mischievous, still incapable of respecting personal boundaries. One attempted to climb directly into the box. Michael gently pushed the curious German Shepherd aside. Not this time. The puppy looked offended, then stole a glove in protest. Michael laughed despite himself. The sound eased some of the tension. Slowly, he opened the lid. The first thing he found was a camera, Emily's favorite. She had carried it everywhere. Next came photographs, school programs, birthday cards, a notebook. Michael sat beside the fireplace and examined each item carefully. Years earlier, he would have collapsed beneath the memories. Now, something felt different. The pain remained, but it no longer controlled the room. As the evening passed, he found himself smiling more than crying. Emily at 16. Emily covered in mud after a hiking trip. Emily holding an impossibly large fish while pretending she had caught it herself. The memories hurt, but they also helped. because grief had convinced him that remembering was dangerous. Love was proving otherwise. Near the bottom of the box, he found a folded letter, blank, unused. Michael stared at it for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, found a pen, returned to the table. The puppies settled nearby. Daisy rested beside the fireplace. Outside, snow drifted gently through the darkness. For several minutes, he simply looked at the paper. Then he began writing. Dear Emily. The words felt awkward, foreign, yet they continued, not because he planned them, because they had waited 10 years to be spoken. He wrote about the argument, the regret, the guilt, the things he wished he had said, the things he wished he had never said. He wrote about Daisy, about Eleanor, about the strange journey that had somehow changed him. Most importantly, he wrote something he had never allowed himself to admit. He missed her. Not the idea of her, not the memory of her, her. When he finished, tears rested quietly on the paper, not the violent tears of despair, the quieter kind, the kind that arrived when a burden finally began loosening its grip. Michael read the letter once, then folded it carefully. He did not place it back into the box. He did not hide it. He placed it beside the fireplace, where he could see it, where it could remain part of the present instead of a prisoner of the past. For years he had believed holding on meant refusing to let go. Now he wondered if true love required something different. Not forgetting, not abandoning. Simply allowing the wound to become a memory. A memory that no longer demanded punishment. The fire crackled softly. Daisy lifted her head. Michael looked at the letter, then at the dog. And for the first time in 10 years, he felt ready to stop speaking only to ghosts. Spring arrived almost unnoticed. The snow melted from the hills, the rivers ran faster, green returned to the valleys. Wyoming seemed to wake slowly from a long sleep. Life had changed during the winter, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough for Michael Turner to notice when he looked back. The man who now drove to Fairhaven each week was not quite the same man who had rescued a German shepherd and 2 puppies beside a lonely forest road months earlier. Some wounds remained, but they no longer controlled every decision. Some memories still hurt, but they no longer demanded punishment. That, Michael had learned, was not the same thing as forgetting. Daisy continued visiting Eleanor. The routine never changed. Every Wednesday, every Saturday, every Sunday afternoon. The old dog would climb into Michael's truck without hesitation. The 2 younger German shepherds, now nearly full-grown, often watched from the cabin porch as Daisy left. Their puppyhood had disappeared quickly. Both carried their mother's intelligence. One was calm and observant. The other remained endlessly curious and occasionally destructive. Together they filled the cabin with movement and life. Meanwhile, Eleanor's condition continued to decline. There were good days, there were difficult days, and there were days when she seemed to drift somewhere between past and present. Yet, whenever Daisy entered the room, something softened, not recognition, something deeper, comfort. One afternoon, Michael sat beside Eleanor while sunlight streamed through the nursing home's windows. Eleanor looked unusually peaceful. For several minutes, she watched birds gather near a fountain outside. Then she spoke. Not to Michael, not exactly. To the air. He's waiting for me. Michael remained silent. He had learned not to interrupt moments like this. Who is? He asked gently. A faint smile appeared. My boy. The words were barely audible. Then the moments passed. Confusion returned. The memory vanished. But the smile remained. Michael sat quietly beside her, thinking. Human beings spent their lives fearing what would be lost. Rarely did they stop to appreciate what remained.
Several weeks later, Sarah called. The phone rang shortly after sunrise. Michael knew before answering. Some news announced itself through silence. Sarah's voice was calm, professional, gentle. Eleanor passed away early this morning. Michael closed his eyes. Outside, birds sang in the trees. Life continued. It always did. Was she alone? He asked. No. Sarah smiled softly through the phone. Daisy was beside her. The answer brought unexpected peace. Michael thanked her, then sat on the porch for a long time. Grief felt different this time, not because Eleanor meant less, because loss no longer felt like failure. People left. That was part of loving them. The important thing was how they left, and Eleanor had not left alone. A small memorial service was held several days later. Nothing elaborate, nothing grand. Exactly the sort of farewell Eleanor would have preferred. The town gathered. Margaret came. Linda came. Pastor Raymond came. Harold arrived carrying flowers that looked awkward in his rough hands. People shared stories, some funny, some sad, some surprising. Each story revealed another version of Eleanor, and Michael smiled when he realized something. Even death had failed to reduce her to a single story. After the service, Sarah handed him a folder. Eleanor wanted these preserved. Inside were copies of several letters, along with one final document. Her wishes. Michael read slowly, then stopped. The old house. The house in the forest. Eleanor wanted it donated, not sold, not abandoned, used. Specifically, she wanted it transformed into a small music center for local children. A place where lessons could be offered regardless of income. A place where nobody would be turned away. For several minutes, Michael stared at the page, then looked toward Daisy. The German shepherd lay quietly beneath a tree, watching, waiting, not unlike the first day they met. Perhaps this had been part of the unfinished task all along. The following months became unexpectedly busy. Volunteers appeared. Carpenters offered labor. Local businesses donated materials. Even people who had never met Eleanor wanted to help. Michael found himself leading much of the work. A year earlier, the idea would have seemed impossible. Now it felt natural. The abandoned house slowly transformed. Broken boards disappeared. Windows were repaired. Fresh paint brightened old walls. The piano from Fairhaven was donated to the project. Children's books filled shelves. Music stands appeared. Laughter returned. Life returned. The forest no longer surrounded an abandoned mystery. It surrounded possibility. The two young German shepherds treated the construction project as their personal kingdom. They ran through the yard, chased butterflies, investigated every toolbox,
Stole more sandwiches than anyone could accurately count. Their energy made everyone laugh. The house that once belonged to grief now belonged to movement. Michael often worked until sunset, then sat on the porch beside Daisy. Sometimes they watched the sky. Sometimes they watched the younger dogs race through the grass. Sometimes they simply sat together. No words necessary. One evening, he brought Emily's letter with him. The letter he had written months earlier. He read it again. Not because he needed closure, because he wanted connection. There was a difference. The pain remained, but it had changed shape. Emily no longer existed as an open wound. She existed as part of him. Part of the reason he kept moving forward. Part of the reason he helped build something meaningful. Love had survived. Only the guilt had faded. By late spring, the music center was finally ready. The opening day arrived beneath bright blue skies. Children filled the yard. Parents gathered near the porch. Music drifted through open windows.
Laughter echoed beneath the trees. For a moment, Michael stood alone near the entrance, watching, listening, remembering. The old house was no longer empty, not of people, not of purpose, not of hope. Nearby, the two young German shepherds raced across the grass, chasing each other in endless circles. And beneath the porch sat Daisy, older now, a little slower, a little grayer, peaceful. Michael smiled and walked toward her. For months he had noticed something, or rather the absence of something. The old habit was gone. The endless watching, the constant staring toward the northern forest, the waiting. Daisy no longer searched the tree line, no longer listened for footsteps, no longer watched roads. The journey that had driven her for years had finally ended. The dog lifted her head. Michael scratched gently behind her ears. Together they looked out across the yard where children laughed and music filled the air. Then he realized something. For the first time since the day he rescued her, Daisy wasn't looking toward the forest anymore, as if the promise she had carried all those years had finally been fulfilled.
Sometimes the miracle isn't that a lost person is found. Sometimes the miracle is that a wounded heart finds its way back to life. In this story, Daisy never gave up on someone who could no longer remember her. From a human perspective, that seems almost impossible. We often measure love by what we receive in return, but true love remains faithful even when memories fade, even when recognition disappears, even when the journey takes years. Perhaps that is why Daisy's loyalty feels so powerful. It reminds us of the kind of love God shows us every day. Michael spent years trapped inside guilt, while Eleanor slowly lost pieces of her past. Yet God used an old dog, an abandoned house, and a series of forgotten letters to bring healing where neither of them expected it. Sometimes God's answers do not arrive as thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, leading us one step at a time toward the place where healing has been waiting all along. If this story touched your heart, please share where you're watching from in the comments, and tell us what part spoke to you most. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories of hope and compassion. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and fill your home with peace in the days ahead.